From the moment she entered the world, she carried a mark that none around her could understand. In an era where superstition ruled plantations just as fiercely as cruelty, a child was born with snow-white hair, as pale as winter frost, and as impossible as a miracle. Her mother swore no omen had been spoken, no curse had been cast, yet the midwives stepped back in terror the moment they saw the infant's head, because in 1840s plantation life, difference was danger, and this child was different in a way no one had ever seen. As she grew, her hair only became brighter, almost glowing under the sun, earning her whispers of ghost child and the pale one. Masters who owned her didn't know whether she was a blessing, a curse, or something entirely beyond their understanding. Some said she was touched by angels, others claimed she was marked by devils, but behind their words was a deeper truth. No one could explain what she was, and that terrified them. Doctors were brought from nearby towns, not one had an answer. They plucked strands of her hair, measured her skin, inspected her eyes, but every test led nowhere. The science of their time simply failed. The plantation's enslaved community protected her in quiet ways, sensing she carried a story that wasn't hers alone. The masters, however, grew obsessed. Her strange appearance sparked experiments, cruel questions, and a kind of attention that became more dangerous with each passing year. The night she was born, the entire plantation seemed to hold its breath, as if the air itself sensed that something unusual was about to enter the world. Her mother had labored quietly, surrounded only by 2 midwives who had delivered dozens of babies in their lifetimes, yet nothing in their experience prepared them for the sight that met them when the infant finally emerged. The child's cry was normal enough, a thin, sharp wail that cut through the humid darkness like a blade, but it was her hair that froze the women in place. Thick strands of pure snow-white hair clung to her scalp, glistening under the flicker of the oil lamp, looking more like silk spun from frost than anything belonging to a newborn girl. For a long moment, no one moved. One midwife crossed her, the other stepped back so abruptly she nearly knocked over the water basin. Her mother, exhausted and trembling, lifted her head only enough to ask if the baby was alive, but the silence that followed her question sent a chill through her already weak body. When one of the women finally found her voice, it was barely more than a whisper, calling the phenomenon unnatural, an omen, something that defied every expectation of birth and life they understood. News traveled fast on a plantation, even faster when touched by fear. Before dawn, whispers began weaving through the cabins like smoke, telling of the strange baby born with the hair of a spirit or a winter ghost. Some said that the child's hair had glowed faintly, though no one could confirm it. Others insisted that such a child could only bring misfortune, that it was a sign from forces beyond human comprehension. The owner of the plantation, a man who prided himself on control and order, was awakened early and told of the unusual birth. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was nothing more than exaggeration from frightened women. But when he arrived at the small shack and saw the infant himself, even he could not mask the flicker of uncertainty in his eye. The girl's hair was not ash blonde or light brown, nor was it the faded gray of the elderly. It was white, true white, with an iridescent sheen that made it look nearly metallic in the lamplight. Her skin was warm, her limbs strong, her cry loud and healthy, yet there was no denying that she bore a mark no one could explain. He instructed the midwives to wash the child again as if dirt or birth fluid might be disguising the real color, but each rinse revealed the same impossible whiteness. Eventually he left, muttering that he would send for someone with medical knowledge, though the midwives knew he was just as shaken as they were. Her mother, cradling the infant to her chest, felt a different kind of fear, not of curses or omens but of the world her daughter had just entered. She knew how difference was treated here. She had seen how even small deviations in appearance or behavior could draw unwanted attention, suspicion or cruelty. As she held the baby close, she whispered prayers under her breath, not knowing whether to ask for protection or forgiveness. Her daughter's hair seemed to glow softly in the shadows, catching every stray reflection of the lamplight, making it impossible for her to pretend this was a normal birth. In the hours that followed, more women from the slave quarters came to see the newborn, some peering in with caution, others with a mix of awe and apprehension. A few believed the child was born blessed, that such whiteness was a sign of purity or divine touch. Others kept their distance entirely, afraid that even looking too long might invite misfortune. The plantation was a place where faith, fear, and superstition lived side by side, each moment shaped by harsh truths and unspoken beliefs, and the arrival of a baby like this stirred every shadow of imagination. By midday the story had already grown. The overseers discussed it in hushed voices, arguing whether the master should isolate the child or treat her as any other newborn. None of them had seen anything like it, and most did not want to. The few enslaved workers who glimpsed the baby carried the image with them back to the fields, spreading talk of what her presence might mean. Some worried she would bring trouble, Others believed she might be connected to spirits that walked between the world of the living and the dead. A few older women recalled tales passed down through generations about children born with marks that foretold great suffering or great change. They wondered whether the plantation was about to experience one or the other. Despite the varied beliefs, one truth held constant among them: the girl was different, and difference never went unnoticed. That afternoon, the plantation owner brought a traveling doctor to examine the infant. The doctor, a man who had delivered several hundred babies in his career, had never encountered anything remotely similar. He checked the baby's vitals, examined her eyes, ears, and limbs, and asked the mother countless questions about her pregnancy. Nothing suggested illness or genetic defect, at least nothing within his understanding. He tugged gently at a lock of her white hair, half expecting it to come loose like fragile threads, but it held firmly, thick, and rooted, a natural part of her body despite its unnatural appearance. He declared the baby healthy but admitted he had no explanation for her hair color. When the master pressed him for theories, he offered only vague possibilities: albinism, some rare mutation, or an anomaly he had never seen. The master didn't like those answers. He wanted certainty, order, predictability, all things the child refused to give. As night settled once more over the plantation, the baby slept quietly in her mother's arms, unaware of the storm of superstition and speculation swirling around her. She had known life for less than a day, yet already her existence had disrupted the fragile balance of fear and routine that governed the land she was born into. Her hair, brighter than moonlight, seemed to defy the darkness around her, reflecting a shimmering halo that made the women nearby shift uneasily. Some wondered if the child would grow into her mysterious mark, if her hair would darken with time or remain as striking as it was now. Others feared what the master might decide if the girl's appearance attracted too much attention or invoked too much suspicion among the enslaved community. And all the while her mother held her close, as if by sheer will she could shield her daughter from the questions that would inevitably arise, the tests she might face, the judgment that awaited her in a world unkind to anything it could not understand. From the moment the girl took her first breath, the plantation's oldest fears began to awaken, creeping out of memories and whispered stories that had been passed down for generations. In a world where suffering was constant and explanations were scarce, people clung to superstition because it offered meaning when reality felt unbearable. So when word spread that a baby had been born with hair the color of winter frost, pure white, untouched by time, untouched by age, the entire community slipped into the only language they knew for such things. The midwives had tried to keep quiet at first, but nothing on a plantation stayed hidden for long. By dawn, the rumor had grown its own legs, racing through the cabins and echoing across the fields before the sun even touched the soil. Some said the baby's hair had shimmered like moonlight. Others whispered that her cry had sounded too sharp, too knowing, that she had entered the world not as a child should, but as something already marked. Superstition took root quickly among the enslaved people, whose lives were shaped by a fragile balance between hope and dread. They believed in signs, in symbols, in the notion that the universe sometimes spoke through the smallest and strangest things. A child with white hair, since birth, was more than strange, it was unheard. As workers prepared for the day, many exchanged wary looks, each wondering what the girl represented. A few older women recalled tales they had heard from their childhoods about children born with brightness in their hair, children said to be caught between worlds, bearing messages from ancestors or warnings of trouble ahead. Such stories were usually told by candlelight, long after bedtime when the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and fear. Now those very stories seemed to have stepped into reality, embodied in a newborn girl whose existence stirred the deepest corners of their belief. But it wasn't only the enslaved who felt unsettled. The plantation owners, though outwardly dismissive of superstition, often carried their own secret fears. They relied on order, predictability, and strict routines to maintain control, so anything that defied those expectations made them uneasy. When word reached the master's wife, she reportedly demanded to know if the child was deformed, cursed, or touched by disease. Her voice, usually sharp but steady, was said to have wavered just slightly as she asked the midwives questions they couldn't possibly answer. Even the overseers, men who prided themselves on toughness and reason, began muttering among themselves, wondering whether such a birth might signal misfortune for the estate. No one wanted to admit they were frightened, yet the tension in the air gave them away. As morning turned to midday, the girls' cabin saw a steady stream of visitors, each one treating the space as though it held something both holy and dangerous. Some stood in the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold, as if a line invisible to everyone but them separated safety from risk. Others stepped closer, whispering prayers or phrases meant to ward off evil. The baby herself remained unaware, fast asleep in her mother's arms, her tiny chest rising and falling with the soft rhythm of new light. Her hair glowed faintly in the filtered sunlight, an impossible contrast to her smooth, dark skin, creating a sight that none of the onlookers had ever imagined they would witness. A few women fell silent at the sight, their lips pressed tightly together as if afraid that speaking her presence aloud might invite consequences. Among the enslaved community, interpretations of the white-haired child varied widely. Some insisted she was a sign of protection, that perhaps a spirit had placed a blessing on her family or marked the girl for a destiny beyond the chains that bound everyone there. They believed such unusual births carried purpose, that the ancestors had chosen her for something significant even if no one yet knew what that purpose might be. These women brought small offerings, a piece of thread, a folded leaf, a soft hum of an old lullaby, small tokens meant to surround the child with gentle energy, to guard her from whatever she might be destined to encounter. Others were more fearful, convinced the baby's hair indicated something darker. They spoke softly of curses, of unseen dangers, of the ways strange births sometimes foretold sickness or disaster. To them, the whiteness wasn't a blessing but a warning, and they worried that the plantation might soon face hardship. One woman swore she felt the air shift the moment she saw the baby, as if an unseen force had entered the room with her. Another claimed that the child made her uneasy, that her skin prickled when she drew near. Though she couldn't explain why, fear has a strange way of settling into people. It doesn't require proof, only possibility, and this child was a possibility no one could easily ignore. The whispers grew darker still when someone insisted that the child had been born under a strange moon. They said the sky had looked different that night, that a thin ring of pale light had circled the moon in a way it rarely did. A few men said they had heard wolves howling in the distant woods, something they had never heard on the property before. Whether any of this was true didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it, and belief more than truth is what shaped superstition. Soon stories began twisting themselves, transforming the simple fact of her white hair into evidence of something supernatural. Even those who didn't fully believe in such things found themselves glancing over their shoulders, wondering if fate had shifted in some subtle way. The baby's mother watched all of this unfold with growing unease. She saw how people looked at her daughter, not with the warmth that usually greeted a newborn, but with a complicated mix of curiosity, fear and reverence. She held her baby closer as if shielding her from the weight of their expectations and anxieties. She whispered calming words into her daughter's tiny ear, words meant for herself just as much as for the infant. She knew that difference on a plantation was not merely unusual, it was danger. And this difference, this brilliant unnatural whiteness, was something no one would overlook. The master too began to feel the pressure of superstition creeping across his land. Though he did not openly speak of spirits or omens, he could not ignore the unrest simmering beneath the surface. He had seen superstition spark panic before, and panic had a way of disrupting productivity. He wanted control restored, explanations found, order re-established, but no explanation came. When he summoned the doctor, when he gathered opinions from others in his circle, every answer was vague, every theory incomplete. Science offered no comfort, no clarity, no reassurance that this birth was simply a harmless anomaly rather than something to fear. And so with each passing hour, the plantation sank deeper into uncertainty, caught between superstition and reality, unsure which one held the truth about the white-haired girl, who had arrived without warning and without explanation. From the moment she learned to, the girl carried the weight of whispers that followed her like an invisible shadow. Even before she understood words, she felt the shift in people's bodies when she approached, the way some stiffened, the way others stepped aside quietly, as though giving space to something they couldn't quite define. Her white hair, once soft and wispy like snow-dusted cotton, grew thicker with every passing year, falling in pale waves that contrasted sharply with her skin. No matter how many times her mother braided it tightly or wrapped it beneath cloth, strands always found a way to escape, catching the light and drawing eyes she had no desire to meet. Childhood should have been a time of innocence, laughter and unawareness. Yet for her it was a constant lesson in the silent language of fear. She noticed early on that the children her age behaved differently around her. Some were curious, fascinated, even daring one another to touch her hair when an adult wasn't looking. They would reach out with tentative fingers, brushing her curls with the same hesitation someone might use to touch a sleeping snake. If nothing happened, if the sky didn't darken, if their skin didn't tingle, they would giggle nervously and run off. Others avoided her completely, convinced that her hair was a sign that she was not meant to be played with, that she belonged to a realm slightly askew from their own. Those children watched her from a distance, whispering stories they barely understood but repeated because they felt true in a place where truth was often shaped by fear, more than fact. Adults were no better. They tried to hide their unease, but she could sense it in the way they spoke to her mother in lowered voices or offered her quick, darting glances before turning away.
Some believed she was marked by something spiritual, good or bad. No one seemed certain. A few older women would murmur prayers under their breath whenever she entered a room, their eyes lingering on her hair. With equal parts dread and fascination, others brought her small gifts, a charm made of twine, a folded scrap of cloth, a whispered blessing. These offerings were meant to protect her, though she could never tell whether they were protecting her from harm, or protecting themselves from whatever they believed might cling to her presence. Life on the plantation followed a strict punishing rhythm, but she always seemed slightly out of sync with it, as though a step behind or ahead of everyone else. When she walked through the fields, she felt the stares burning into her back, not cruel but wary. Conversations would stop as she passed, then resume again in hushed tones, the content shifting from weather and work to speculation about her purpose. She had grown used to this by the time she reached age 6 or 7, though the acceptance was not one of comfort but resignation. She understood that she was different, not because anyone told her directly, but because it soaked into every interaction, every breath, every moment she existed among others. Her mother tried to shelter her from the worst of it. She spoke softly to her, teaching her how to move through the world with caution, how to keep her head down but her senses sharp. She explained little, hoping perhaps that the girl might live a childhood free from the burden of meanings she could not change. But even her mother could not control what others saw. The plantation was a place where small differences became large concerns, where anything out of the ordinary had the potential to upset the fragile balance that kept life moving in its harsh, predictable rhythm. Her daughter's hair was more than out of the ordinary, it was unprecedented, and that alone made it a living symbol of the unknown. When she was old enough to understand words but not old enough to understand the world, she began to ask questions. Why did others look at her the way they did? Why did some children run from her? Why did the master's wife flinch every time she caught sight of her? Her mother answered gently but never fully, offering half-truths meant to comfort rather than inform. She told her that people sometimes feared what they didn't understand, that they didn't mean harm, that they were simply unsure how to act around someone who looked different. But the girl sensed there was more beneath those words, something deeper, something tied to the strange silence that filled rooms whenever she entered them. She felt it in the way grown men who commanded the fields avoided her gaze, in the way elders watched her with eyes that seemed to see not just her but something beyond her. As she grew older, the whispers changed tone. They shifted from frightened confusion to uneasy expectation, as though people were waiting for something to happen to her or because of her. Children her age began inventing stories about what her hair meant, that she could see spirits, that she knew things before they happened, that she carried a piece of winter inside her despite the brutal southern heat. None of these things were true, yet somehow each rumor increased the distance between her and the world around her. The stories shaped her more than she shaped them, creating a myth out of a girl who only wanted to be despite the fear that surrounded her. There were moments, small fleeting moments when she glimpsed kindness. An old woman once sat beside her and braided her hair without hesitation, her fingers steady and gentle. A young boy shared a stolen peach with her, insisting she take the larger half because, as he put it quietly, they treat you strange, and it ain't right. These acts did not erase the isolation she felt, but they carved out spaces where she could breathe without the weight of superstition pressing down on her. Still, the loneliness seeped into her bones. She wondered constantly what life would be like if her hair were black or brown or even sandy blonde like some of the mixed children on the plantation. Would she be allowed to play freely? Would people smile at her instead of watching her with guarded eyes? Would she feel like she belonged to a community instead of hovering at its edges? These questions haunted her, forming a silent ache that grew alongside her body. As her hair lengthened, so too did the story. Some claimed she was destined for something great, that the ancestors had chosen her for a purpose no one could yet see. Others believed she was a harbinger of misfortune, that her presence alone might invite suffering or change. The plantation existed in a fragile balance built on fear, power and oppression, and anything that hinted at unpredictability became a threat. Even the master seemed unsure what to make of her. He watched her with narrowed eyes whenever their paths crossed, not with the cruelty he often displayed toward others, but with a cold, calculating expression that suggested he was trying to understand a puzzle that refused to be solved. Her childhood unfolded under this constant tension, a strange blend of caution and curiosity, fear and fascination. She learned to move quietly, to speak softly, to take up as little space as possible. Yet no matter how invisible she tried to be, her hair, her impossible gleaming white hair, made her a beacon for attention she neither wanted nor understood. And as the years passed, the whispers only grew stronger, creating a world where isolation became as familiar to her as her own reflection, shaping her identity long before she had the chance to shape it herself.
From the time she was old enough to hold still, she became the subject of examinations she neither asked for nor understood. Plantation doctors came and went, summoned every few months by a master who was determined to find an explanation for her white hair, an answer that could satisfy his need for control, for order, for rationality in a world he ruled through force. The girl, meanwhile, sat quietly on wooden stools or rough beds while strangers poked, prodded, and measured her with growing frustration. They lifted her eyelids to study the color of her irises, pressed fingers against her scalp to test the strength of her roots, compared the pallor of her hair to strands of cotton, animal fur, and bleached cloth as though matching shades would unlock some secret. She learned early that these visits were not for her well-being but for their curiosity, their fear disguised as science, their impatience disguised as professionalism. The doctors rarely spoke to her directly. They addressed the master, the overseer, or even her mother, but almost never the girl whose body they examined as though she were a puzzle rather than a person. They used words she didn't understand, terms like anomaly, genetic peculiarity, pigment deficiency, each delivered with a furrowed brow and a shake of the head. One doctor insisted on cutting off a long lock of her hair for study, watching it shimmer as he held it against the sunlight. Another inspected her nails, her teeth, her skin under different lamps, determined to find some clue that would explain what he considered unnatural. Each examination ended the same way, with confusion, irritation, and the begrudging admission that no known medical explanation fit her condition. As she grew older, the procedures became more invasive. One particularly determined doctor arrived with a wooden case filled with tools she had never seen before. Thin metal needles, glass vials, tiny instruments that glinted ominously. He pricked her skin to watch how it healed, cupped her chin to study the shape of her jaw, listened to her heartbeat as if expecting it to sound different from anyone else's. She endured it all in silence, not because she lacked fear but because she had learned that questioning adults only made things worse. Her mother stood nearby during every examination, her jaw clenched tightly, her hands curling into fists that never quite closed. She knew her daughter was being treated like property, like something to be dissected, analyzed, and categorized, but speaking up was a danger she could not risk. Not when the master himself stood watching with eyes sharp enough to cut. The doctors were not the only ones fascinated by her. Occasionally, wealthier visitors from nearby towns or plantations would stop by, sometimes under the pretense of business, sometimes openly curious about the white-haired girl they had heard whispers about. They would request to see her, and the master, eager to display the curiosity he owned, would oblige. These visitors observed her with a mix of fascination and discomfort, leaning in close as though expecting to hear something unusual in her breathing or catch a glimpse of magic in her eye. A few even reached out to touch her hair without asking, their fingers trembling slightly as though they feared it might burn them. She learned to hold still and wait until they were satisfied, feeling each brush of their hands like a reminder that she was seen not as a child but as something strange, something that belonged under scrutiny. She often wondered why the color of her hair mattered so much. She watched other children play freely in the dirt, laughing and shouting without attracting a single curious stare. They ran through the fields, climbed trees, splashed in puddles, their presence unremarkable in the eyes of the adults around them. Yet she, simply by walking across a room or stepping into the sunlight, seemed to command attention she never asked for. It puzzled her how something as simple as hair could separate her from the rest of the world, how it could make people treat her as though she were a marvel or a warning, depending on who was looking. Her mother tried to reassure her that nothing was wrong, that she was simply different in a way others did not understand, but even her mother's voice wavered sometimes, revealing the fear she tried to hide. She had grown up in a world where deviation invited danger, where anything unusual had the potential to provoke suspicion or violence. She had seen too many examples of how curiosity from the master could turn into obsession, how obsession could turn into cruelty. So every time a doctor was summoned, every time a visitor asked questions, every time the master watched her with that calculating expression, her mother felt a knot tighten inside her chest. She feared that these examinations were not harmless, that they were leading somewhere unknown and potentially perilous. Some doctors spoke of keeping records, of sending letters to colleagues in distant cities, of sharing her case with men of science who might be able to offer insight. They seemed eager to make her existence known beyond the plantation, eager to claim they had discovered something rare and unexplained. One doctor suggested bringing her to a larger town for further testing, proposing a trip that made her mother's blood run cold. She knew the risks of taking her daughter away from familiar faces and into a world where she would be surrounded entirely by strangers who saw her as an object of study. The master dismissed the idea for the moment, but not because he cared for her safety. He simply feared the cost and inconvenience. Still, the suggestion lingered in the air, a threat cloaked in polite medical language. Over time, the girl began to dread the sound of carriage wheels approaching the property. She knew it often meant another doctor, another round of examinations, another day spent sitting still while people discussed her as though she were dead. Each visit left her feeling more exposed, more separated from the world she wished to belong to. She longed for anonymity, for the kind of life where adults ignored her as they ignored most children unless they were misbehaving. But such a life was impossible for her. Her hair, glowing almost unnaturally in the sunlight, made sure of that. The plantation workers watched these visits from a distance, their concern growing with each new doctor who left shaking his head. They had their own theories rooted in folklore and ancestral wisdom, theories that felt more comforting than the doctor's cold confusion. Some believed her condition was a sign of spiritual significance, that she carried messages from realms beyond the living. Others thought she might possess a fate that would one day change the course of her life dramatically. They offered her small protections, whispered prayers, charms woven into the cloth she wore, touches of reassurance that she held onto when the examinations left her feeling more like a curiosity than a child. The master, however, saw her differently. To him, her uniqueness was not spiritual or mysterious, it was valuable. He believed she could bring prestige, attention, perhaps even profit if the right people became interested. His eyes followed her everywhere, cataloging her growth, noting every change in her appearance, waiting for something he couldn't yet define. The girl felt this gaze even when he wasn't speaking, a weight pressing on her shoulders like a silent demand she had no means to fulfill. And still, no doctor could explain her. Their notebooks filled with observations, their cases filled with samples, yet every conclusion they reached was incomplete. She remained a medical puzzle in a world with few scientific answers, a child caught between the superstitions of the enslaved community and the cold curiosity of men who sought rational explanations. Each failed examination deepened the mystery surrounding her, each unanswered question feeding the unsettling sense that something about her lay beyond the reach of science entirely. The memory of that evening clings to the walls of that house like smoke, thick and unwilling to disappear, as if it knows that forgetting would be an act of betrayal. It began with something so small, so easy to ignore that anyone else might have dismissed it as imagination, but the people in that house had lived with too many shadows, too many unspoken truths, to believe that strange things were ever just accident. The hallway smelled of dust and cold iron, as if the air had not been stirred in decades, though everyone had walked through it that very morning. And when the lantern flickered the first time, gently, almost politely, no one reacted. But when it flickered again twice, then went out completely for a heartbeat before coming back to life, the room fell silent in a way that only fear can command. At first, no one wanted to address what was happening. The mother kept her eyes on the sewing in her lap, but the needle no longer moved. The eldest son pretended to read, though the page had remained untouched for minutes. Even the ticking of the clock seemed hesitant, the sound stretching slightly, as if time itself was listening. But the youngest, who had not yet learned the art of pretending, whispered that he had heard someone walking upstairs again, even though everyone knew that the attic had been locked. They had locked it themselves, with their own hands, with keys they still kept hidden in their pockets like talismans. Yet the child spoke with the certainty of someone who had no reason to lie, a sound like soft dragging, like bare feet, sliding against wooden floorboards, had drifted down the staircase earlier, just before the lantern had flickered. No one wanted to believe him, but everyone knew exactly what he had heard. The mother finally lifted her gaze, her eyes heavy with a fear she had carried for years but never named. She asked him when he had heard. He pointed to the ceiling with a trembling finger, as if afraid that the attic itself might look back at him. Then a single unmistakable thump echoed from above, sharp and deliberate, as if whoever was up there wanted them to know she was awake. The room froze, not a breath moved. They all knew that sound, they had heard it before, and every time it came something bad followed, something that left marks on the house, on the walls, on their own memory, but none of them had dared to speak of it aloud, not even when it haunted their dreams. The eldest son stood up too fast, knocking over the chair. His voice trembled even as he tried to sound firm. He said it was probably an animal, a bird trapped somehow, or maybe a branch hitting the roof, but no one believed him, not even he himself. Everyone's mind had already returned to that night, the night the attic door had slammed on its own, the night the screaming had echoed, until sunrise, the night when they had all sworn to never open that door again, the night that had changed them in ways they refused to acknowledge, the night that had made them hide the truth, bury it like a body under the floorboards. The lantern flickered again, violently this time, as if something had brushed against it. The flame stretched sideways, straining toward the staircase like a reaching hand. The mother clasped her rosary so hard her knuckles turned white. She whispered a prayer, her voice almost drowned by the increasingly irregular ticking of the clock. The eldest daughter pressed her palms over her ears,
even though no sound was being made now. It was the silence that terrified her, the heavy, suffocating silence that only occurred before the house did something, before she did something. The thumping started again, this time in a steady rhythm, like footsteps pacing from one side of the attic to the other, slow, measured. Wait, the youngest began to cry softly, insisting that she was angry because they had left her alone, because the dark made her restless, because she didn't want to be locked away anymore. His words were not his own. He spoke them, the way one repeats something overheard, something whispered into the ear in the dead of night. The mother pressed her trembling fingers to his lips, begging him to stop speaking, begging him not to repeat her voice. But it was too late. The temperature in the room dropped so fast that their breaths turned visible. The lantern flame shrank into a thin blue line, and then, as if to confirm every fear that had ever lived within that house, a shadow moved behind the attic door, a distinct silhouette, unmistakably human, pausing just behind the thin wooden frame, as though listening, as though deciding whether to come down. The eldest son gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood creaked. No one dared to speak, no one dared to breathe. They all waited for the sound they dreaded most, the slow creaking of the attic steps under the weight of someone who should not exist, someone who should have been gone, someone whose death should have ended everything. But death had solved nothing. Instead, it had trapped her here, sealed her into the very walls that now seemed to pulse with her presence. The name lingered in the air long after it was spoken, as if it had weight, as if it carried its own temperature, heavy and cold enough to settle into the lungs of everyone present. No one dared to repeat it, even though it throbbed silently in their minds like a bruise. It was a name they had banished from the household not by force but by fear, a name that once belonged to a living girl, breathing and warm, yet now existed only as a presence that refused to fade. The moment the mother uttered it, the faint scratches from the attic stopped abruptly, as though the thing upstairs had turned its head and begun listening. A hush fell across the room, a hush so complete that it seemed unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The eldest son swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. He had been strong once, or at least had pretended to be, but something about that name stripped him down to the frightened boy he had been the night. Everything changed. The lantern's flame leaned once again toward the staircase, a thin blue flicker, bending as though pulled by an invisible draft coming from above. The mother closed her eyes, whispering something under her breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a plea, maybe just a name repeated in regret. It didn't matter. Nothing they said now could undo what had already been done. The youngest child, still trembling, leaned against her shoulder. He claimed again, this time barely audible, that she was angry, that she knew they had spoken her name, that she didn't like being forgotten. His voice carried a strange resonance, almost as if someone else were speaking through him, someone whose presence filled the room even though her body had long been confined to the darkness above. The daughter let out a small gasp, pressing her hands tighter against her ear. She said she could hear whispers now, soft, almost musical, drifting down through the ceiling boards, repeating words none of them could quite catch. But the tone was unmistakable. It was the same gentle, sorrowful humming Dinah used to make when she sat alone, rocking back and forth long before they locked her away. A dull creak echoed through the house, then another. Footsteps, light, familiar, but wrong, began descending in that slow rhythmic way, pausing just long enough between each step to make the silence unbearable. The attic door did not open. It didn't need to. The sound alone was enough to drag every buried memory back to the surface. Memories they had spent years trying to shut behind that door in silence, with rituals, with prayers, with lies told to themselves in the dark. But the truth had a way of seeping through wooden nails, through locks and keys. The mother stood abruptly, as though pulled to her feet by invisible hands. Her face had drained of all color. She backed against the wall, shaking her head, whispering, "Not again," over and over, as if repetition could change the reality closing in around them. The eldest son moved to stand in front of her instinctively, but his legs barely held. His shadow stretched long across the floor, distorted by the trembling flame. The youngest started crying again, louder this time, covering his face, as though afraid of seeing her appear at the base of the stair. Then the scratching resumed, this time at the underside of the attic floor, directly above them, slow, deliberate, tracing long arcs like fingers dragging along wood. The eldest daughter whimpered, gripping the edge of the sofa, until her knuckles turned white. She had seen the marks before. She remembered the night they appeared, the gouges, long and desperate, carved into the floorboards inside the attic by hands that should not have been strong enough to make them. She remembered the way they had looked like pleas for rescue, not threat. The mother clutched her rosary tighter, but even she knew it had no power here. Dinah had not been a creature of evil. She had not been something summoned or cursed. She had simply been a girl, lonely, frightened and betrayed in ways no child should ever. That is why her presence felt so wrong, so heavy, so inescapable. It was not the rage of a monster, but the grief of someone wronged, someone forgotten, someone who had died within sight of the very people who were supposed to protect her. A soft sob echoed from somewhere. It wasn't one of the children. It wasn't any of them. The sound drifted down the stairwell like a fragile ribbon of sorrow. It was unmistakably a girl's sob, thin, shaking, as though she had been crying for hours, maybe years. The mother pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle her own cry. She recognized that sob. She had heard it long before it belonged to a memory. She had heard it through the attic door on that final night, when her shame and fear had frozen her in place outside, while Dinah begged to be let out. Suddenly the lantern died, completely. The room was plunged into a darkness, so thick it felt like cloth, suffocating and dense. Someone gasped sharply. Someone else prayed under their breath. The youngest whimpered that he felt cold, fingers on his arm. The mother reached for him blindly, her hands brushing empty air. The darkness seemed to pulse, a slow heartbeat-like rhythm, as though something was moving through it, drawing closer.
Rumors have a strange way of traveling across plantations faster than wagons, faster than riders, faster even than fear itself. They slide through the cracks of wooden cabins, drift through cotton fields with the morning fog, settle between whispers shared over dying fires, and when the story is strange enough, when it contains even the faintest trace of the supernatural, it does not merely spread, it mutates. Each retelling shifts its shape, adding a new detail, a new theory, a new layer of dread, until the subject becomes less a person, and more an omen, whispered with caution. That was how her name, never spoken loudly, never uttered twice in the same breath, became something forbidden. The girl with the snow-white hair had once been just another child on the plantation, another small figure forced to grow up too quickly under the sun. But the moment people from neighboring estates learned about her unusual appearance, she became a symbol, a warning, a curiosity wrapped in danger. Word traveled from one cabin to the next, carried by enslaved men, returning from borrowed tools, carried by women who traded vegetables or medicine in secret, carried by children who overheard whispers not meant for them. Every person who heard the tale added something of their own. Some said she was born during a full moon, her hair glowing like frost under its light. Others swore they had seen her eyes shimmer silver at dusk, reflecting something no human eyes should reflect. A few claimed she spoke to things no one else could see. No matter which version traveled the farthest, they all shared the same root, a child who should not exist, a child the natural world did not know how to explain. It wasn't long before overseers from nearby plantations began asking strange questions. They visited under the pretense of business, but their eyes wandered restlessly, scanning the fields for a glimpse of her. They lingered near the quarters pretending to inspect tools or livestock while actually listening for the sound of her voice. Some of them grew bold enough to ask the master directly if the stories were true. He lied each time, of course. He claimed no such girl lived under his watch, but denial only made the rumors stronger, because secrecy always feeds curiosity, and curiosity in those years was often more dangerous than hate. Within weeks the girl had become a myth carried across counties. Plantation owners and their wives debated her existence over dinner tables. Superstitious field hands whispered her story to travelers in exchange for tobacco or bread. Even preachers began weaving warnings about her into sermons, urging their congregations to beware of signs and wonders that did not come from God. Some saw her as a miracle, others as an abomination, but no one saw her as a child. The enslaved community, however, reacted differently. They had known her since she took her first breath. They had held her, fed her, soothed her cries. They had watched her hair brighten like freshly fallen snow with each passing year. And though they feared what others would do to her, they did not fear her. They sensed something fragile in her, something wounded and lonely beneath all the strange beauty. To them she was a child who needed protection, not a symbol to be feared or exploited. So they began shielding her in small, quiet ways. Women rearranged chores so she would not have to walk past the cabins where outsiders often lingered. Men offered to work longer hours if it meant keeping her out of sight. Children were taught never to speak her name outside the quarters, no matter how tempted they were to whisper her story. And when visitors came, they hid her the way one hides a candle from the wind, not because the wind might put it out, but because it might reveal a flame too bright for safety. In the evenings she would sit by the edge of the fields, humming soft broken tunes while older women braided her white hair into tight coils, so it would be less noticeable in the dim light. They told her stories to keep her calm, stories about spirits who walked among the living, not to frighten her but to remind her she was not alone in her difference. Yet even they could not explain why her hair glowed faintly in the moonlight, or why animals grew strangely still whenever she passed, or why her presence made shadows behave as if they knew her. As the rumors spread farther, the danger grew with them. A wealthy master from a neighboring county sent a rider demanding to see the girl. When refused, he sent another rider with a pouch of silver coins. When refused again, he sent a threat wrapped in polite words. Others followed: letters, offers, quiet inquiries, and not so quiet suggestions that the master was hiding something valuable. The idea of ownership twisted itself around the girl like a choking vine, transforming her from a child into an object people believed they could trade, study, or claim. Inside the quarters, the atmosphere changed. Conversations that once carried warmth now carried tension. People spoke in codes, in unfinished sentences, in glances exchanged over the fire. Mothers pulled their children close at night, whispering prayers that the rumors would die before someone decided to take action. Elders told the younger ones not to stray beyond the fields. Every sound in the night, a horse's neigh, a wagon wheel turning, footsteps on gravel, made hearts race, because they all knew what happened when outsiders grew obsessed with something they didn't understand. The girl sensed the shift too. She saw the way people looked at her with a mix of love and fear, the way their voices dropped when she entered a room. She noticed how often she was told to stay indoors, how quickly adults changed the subject when she asked questions. She didn't understand why people beyond the plantation cared so deeply about her hair, her skin, her presence. She didn't know the danger she represented simply by being alive. But the enslaved community knew. They had seen far too many lives ripped apart, over far less. They had watched children sold because of the color of their eyes, women punished because of a single rumor, men taken because someone wanted a strong pair of hands. And this girl, strange, beautiful, unexplainable, was something far more valuable in the eyes of those who saw the world only through greed and power. The whispers followed her everywhere now. Even when people tried to hide them, she could feel them drifting in the air like cold threads brushing her skin. The legend she had become was no longer something they controlled. It belonged to the world beyond the fields, a world that was coming closer with each retelling, each hungry glance cast across the county lines. As the years passed, her white hair grew brighter, thicker, and more impossible with each sunrise, catching the light in a way that made people stare longer than they should. It was no longer merely unusual. It became a beacon, impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. Even from a distance, strangers could recognize her before they saw her face, and the way the light glinted off her pale strands made her presence feel almost unreal. The field hands who worked beside her daily began to treat her with an unspoken caution, a reverence reserved for things they neither understood nor wanted to test. Children would pause mid-laugh, adults would freeze mid-step, and all of them knew, deep down, that her hair carried a weight beyond mere curiosity. At first, the master's fascination was clinical, an obsession with something that defied explanation. He demanded to see her, to have her measured, examined, and described. Doctors were summoned from distant towns, people with degrees and strange instruments, yet none could offer even a hint of understanding. They observed the glint of her hair, the tone of her skin, the color of her eyes, searching for anomalies in her blood or bones, yet every test returned with the same unsettling truth. She was perfectly healthy. The abnormality, they admitted, was entirely cosmetic and yet entirely inexplicable. That contradiction fascinated him, twisted his curiosity into something darker. The more he watched, the more his attention shifted from the surface of her body to the patterns in her behavior, her walk, her gestures, the rhythm of her breathing. It was all subject to scrutiny. He became obsessive with her presence in his household, arranging for her to be near but never too near, his fascination teetering on the edge of something dangerous. He began to see signs in her movement, as if her hair responded to emotion, as if the light caught in it when she was frightened, joyful, or angry. People whispered that she seemed luminous, not just in appearance but in aura, that she carried an energy that made the air itself feel charged. Within the enslaved community, fear and wonder mingled in equal measure. Those who had raised her, who had sung lullabies over her cradle, now recognized her as something more than human. They sensed that her hair, white since birth, impossibly bright, was a signal, a marker of a destiny they could neither understand nor control. The women began weaving protective charms into the braids they tied each morning, small knots of string, slips of herbs, whispered prayers meant to shield her from attention that was not just curious but predatory. Men made certain the paths she walked were safe, moving obstacles and keeping strangers at a distance. Children were warned, quietly, not to speak her name outside the quarters. Every act was precautionary, a silent acknowledgement that her uniqueness carried risks far beyond ordinary danger. But the master saw it differently. He did not view her as fragile.
He did not see her as a child. He saw her as possession, as curiosity, as spectacle. His fascination deepened into obsession, and obsession often bends the mind. He began devising ways to monitor her more closely, sending for servants to report every detail of her day. He demanded records of how her hair had grown, how it reacted to the sun, to wind, to candlelight. He instructed that she be photographed, sketched, and described in exhaustive detail. These instructions were carried out with fear and meticulous care, each observer aware that the smallest omission could be interpreted as disobedience. The girl, still young, felt the weight of their attention like a physical hand pressing against her shoulders, constraining her in ways words could not convey. Rumors about her brightness traveled far beyond the plantation. Merchants, travelers, and neighboring landowners began to speak of her in hushed tones. Some described her as a ghost, a spirit cloaked in flesh, her hair like moonlight caught in motion. Others claimed she was cursed, that touching her hair would bring misfortune, that looking directly at her was an invitation for disaster. Yet others whispered that she was blessed, that her uniqueness carried the favor of something divine, that to be near her was to brush against fate itself. Wherever the story went, it carried with it both awe and fear, and the master reveled in the attention, simultaneously proud and uneasy, knowing that fascination often bred both opportunity and danger.
Within the household, the girl herself became increasingly aware of the power her hair held. She noticed how people shifted when she entered a room, how conversations stopped mid-sentence, how even her peers treated her differently. At times she felt a strange pride in this attention, a flicker of control in a world that otherwise demanded obedience. But it was always tempered by fear, fear of the master's obsession, fear of the stranger's curiosity, fear of the stories that traveled faster than she could escape. She began to move carefully, her gestures measured, her presence calculated, as though she had learned that survival depended on controlling not only herself but the way others perceived her. Her hair itself seemed to respond to the emotions around her. On bright mornings when the sun lit the plantation in golden haze, it appeared to shimmer, the strands almost luminous, drawing the gaze of anyone near. On overcast days the brightness seemed to deepen, striking against the gray light as though it had absorbed the storm itself. She began to notice that her own moods affected it subtly, that her anger, or joy or fear seemed to make the light in her hair shift in intensity. She did not understand why, but she sensed that it was part of the reason people watched her with awe, and it was as if her hair had a language of its own, speaking in glints and shadows, whispering secrets that no one else could hear. The master's obsession became more pronounced as he tried to claim knowledge of what he could not understand. He commanded that she spend time in certain rooms, in certain lights, at certain times of day, as though her hair's brilliance could be harnessed or studied systematically. He sought to control her visibility, her movements, the very way she existed in the world. His fascination teetered on cruelty, though he did not intend it as such. It was rooted in a need to dominate the unknown, to possess what could not be explained. Every glance he cast, every instruction he gave, reinforced for her the danger inherent in simply being her. Despite the fear that surrounded her, she began to recognize patterns in people's behavior. She learned who could be trusted, who would glance and turn away politely, who might linger a moment too long, and who sought to observe her like a specimen. Her awareness became a she adapted, learning to modulate her presence, to control how her hair fell, how the light caught it, and when she chose to be seen or hidden. She became fluent in the silent language of survival, reading attention like a map, navigating it carefully. And yet, no matter how careful she was, the brightness of her hair betrayed her, refusing to be ignored, refusing to be fully contained. Stories of her brilliance reached far beyond the estate, and with every retelling her legend grew. Some claimed that her hair could reflect the moon's light even at noon. Others insisted that it shone when she was near danger. The tales became warnings and wonders alike, and people outside the plantation began to treat the child as more than human. Scholars, travelers, and strangers with curiosity bordering on obsession spoke of her in letters, claiming her existence challenged everything known about nature. No one could explain her, and that impossibility transformed her into a force, subtle yet undeniable, shaping the world around her, even before she understood it herself. By the time she reached early adolescence, the girl had begun to understand the full weight of the attention she commanded. Her hair, impossibly white and glimmering even in the dull light of the quarters, drew eyes wherever she went, and she moved through the world as though navigating a maze built entirely of invisible walls. She understood, with a clarity beyond her years, that her existence was a spectacle, that her presence disrupted the ordinary rhythms of the plantation, that she was something others whispered about, measured, feared,
and the enslaved community did what it could to shield her, but even their efforts were limited. Outside curiosity was a tide that could not be held back. Every day brought new gazes, new questions, new rumors, each one adding weight to her shoulders and sharpening the isolation she had always felt. The master's obsession with her only intensified. He instructed his overseers to watch her closely, to note her movements, her expressions and the subtle ways in which the light struck her hair. Doctors were still summoned, though their observations offered nothing conclusive. They prodded, measured and tested, then recorded their findings meticulously in leather-bound journals. Yet every report ended in frustration. She was strong, healthy, perfectly normal in every sense apart from the luminescent color of her hair. The master, unsatisfied with the limits of science, sought to impose control in other ways. He attempted to regulate when she ate, where she went, even the tasks she performed in the field. His interference was subtle at first, small adjustments that seemed to be for her benefit, but the underlying intention was clear, to dominate the anomaly he could not explain. The enslaved community responded with a combination of fear and defiance. They continued to weave protective charms into her hair, taught her the safe paths through the fields, and whispered warnings about strangers who watched too close. They recounted old tales, cautionary stories of children who had been sold, taken or vanished when the world's curiosity had turned from admiration to obsession. Each story was meant to prepare her, to instill awareness of her vulnerability, even as they reassured her that she was not alone. The care they showed was precise and deliberate, a network of small, almost invisible acts designed to protect her from both the known dangers of the world and the unknown ones her mere existence seemed to invite. Her understanding of these dynamics deepened as she observed the behaviors of those around her. Children treated her differently. Some avoided her outright, fearing that proximity might carry consequences, while others approached cautiously, drawn by the shimmer of her hair, fascinated yet wary. Adults often spoke in hushed tones, glances flicking toward her as if they were measuring not only her presence but the effect it had on them. Even the animals seemed to respond to her uniquely. Dogs would stop and watch her pass, birds would fall silent in her vicinity, and livestock often shifted uneasily under her gaze. She began to perceive these patterns not as coincidences but as signals, as an unspoken code she had to interpret for her own survival. Rumors beyond the plantation continued to grow. Travelers, merchants and landowners from neighboring estates sent inquiries, sometimes in person, sometimes through letters carried by trusted messengers. The girl's existence was no longer simply known. It was a subject of speculation, a challenge to conventional understanding of nature, a story that inspired fear and fascination in equal measure. Some whispered that her hair was a sign of divine favor, others that it was a curse, a mark of misfortune or hidden power. Stories circulated that she could see things others could not, that her presence influenced events, that those who approached too boldly were met with misfortune. The exaggerations compounded, but the core truth remained undeniable. Her hair was unlike anything anyone had seen, and no explanation, whether scientific, spiritual or rational, could account for it. Within the household, the tension surrounding her continued to escalate. The master's attention was relentless, his desire to study and control her all-consuming. He arranged for her to be observed under different conditions, in varying lights, at specific times of day, as though attempting to extract a pattern from her very existence. He sought to understand her, to categorize her, to claim mastery over a reality that refused to yield to his authority. His fascination bordered on obsession, and it became increasingly difficult for the enslaved community to hide their protective effort. Every interaction, every instruction, every movement of the girl was scrutinized, and even small deviations from the master's expectations were noted, recorded or questioned. The girl herself became acutely aware of this scrutiny. She learned to move with precision, to temper her expressions, to control her gestures, understanding that the smallest act could draw attention she did not want. She became fluent in the silent language of perception, reading glances, measuring distance, and anticipating the reactions of those around her. Her awareness was a form of armor, a way to navigate a world that treated her not as a child, but as an anomaly, an object of fascination that could provoke consequences, simply by existing. And yet, no matter how careful she was, the impossibility of her hair betrayed her. It shimmered, it caught light, it drew eyes, it reminded everyone that she was different, that she was extraordinary, that she existed on a plane of possibility and fear, that none of them could control. Even within the enslaved community, the weight of her uniqueness was palpable. Though they revered and protected her, they also recognized that she carried a danger they could neither fully explain nor contain. They whispered that her hair was not merely a physical attribute, but a symbol of something larger, something that might one day influence lives far beyond the plantation. Mothers warned their children to respect her space, to speak her name only in private, to observe rather than interact unless guidance was explicitly given. Elders performed subtle rituals of protection, using small charms, whispered words, and gestures meant to shield her from attention that could bring harm. Each act, though invisible to outsiders, was a thread in a delicate network of care, woven to preserve her life in the fragile equilibrium around her. Her own perception of herself evolved under this pressure. She began to view her hair not simply as a curiosity or a spectacle, but as a part of her identity with power she could not yet fully comprehend. It was both a shield and a beacon, drawing attention she could never completely avoid, yet providing an intangible form of influence over those around her. She became aware that her presence could alter behavior, evoke fear, or command respect, and she learned to wield this awareness cautiously. The awareness was both gift and burden, for it separated her from peers and family in ways no one could remedy. Stories of her brightness and her presence continued to spread, and with each retelling the legend grew. Scholars, travelers, and distant observers claimed that she existed outside conventional understanding, that she challenged scientific principles, that she bore a significance that could not be ignored. Some spoke of her in letters as a prodigy, a marvel, a child who might carry knowledge or power beyond ordinary comprehension. Others whispered that she was cursed, that misfortune clung to her hair, that her existence demanded caution. The dichotomy only reinforced the girl's isolation, placing her in a liminal space between fear and reverence, between curiosity and obsession, between myth and reality.
By the time she had reached her later teenage years, the girl had become something almost legendary within the plantation and the surrounding areas. Her hair, white since birth, now cascaded in a shimmering river down her back, catching every ray of sunlight, every flicker of firelight, until it seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. People often described it as unnatural, impossible, almost like the strands had been spun from frost or moonlight itself. The master's fascination had escalated from curiosity to obsession, and he had begun devising ever more elaborate ways to monitor her, to study her, to assert control over her presence in the household. Every hour of her life, it seemed, was watched, measured, recorded, and scrutinized with a meticulousness that bordered on cruelty. He believed that if he could understand her, if he could categorize her, he could possess her, and perhaps even command the impossible. Doctors were still summoned from distant towns, but they arrived only to leave frustrated. No known medicine, no study of pigmentation, no cataloging of blood or bone could explain the brilliance of her hair. They admitted defeat silently, their notes filled with hesitant words and open-ended questions that conveyed more confusion than understanding. The girl had learned to endure these examinations with quiet resignation. She had memorized the instruments, anticipated the questions, and learned which gestures and positions caused the least attention. Yet, no matter how she moved or how she behaved, the impossible brightness of her hair betrayed her, ensuring that she was never entirely invisible, never truly private, and never free from the gaze of others. Even the enslaved community, though protective and devoted, felt the tension that her presence created. They knew the dangers of attracting attention from outsiders, particularly from those who did not understand her, or who were motivated by greed or obsession. They whispered instructions, gave warnings in subtle gestures, and crafted small charms and protective rituals designed to shield her from prying eyes. Children were instructed to remain silent, elders watched for signs of intrusion, and mothers adjusted the routines of their households to ensure that she remained as protected as possible. Yet, no matter the precautions, the girl's presence carried weight, a force that could not be entirely controlled, a brilliance that drew curiosity and fear alike. Her awareness of herself and her surroundings had become keen, almost preternatural. She learned to move in ways that mitigated attention, to position herself in shadows when possible, to modulate her expressions and gestures so that she would be less provocative, yet still maintain a degree of autonomy. She had developed an acute understanding of the subtle language of glances, of hesitation, of distance, knowing which observers might be dangerous and which could be trusted, even if only temporarily. Every step was a calculated decision, every action measured, and every encounter weighed for its consequences. Her hair, a symbol of wonder and danger, had become both a tool and a trap. Outside the immediate plantation, the stories of her uniqueness continued to spread, gaining momentum with each retelling. Travelers, merchants and landowners from distant estates spoke of her as though she were something more than human, a living anomaly, a mystery defying natural law. Some claimed her hair shone under moonlight even in the midday sun. Others whispered that her presence brought subtle misfortune or unforeseen events. The stories varied in detail but shared a central truth. She was extraordinary, and the world beyond her home had taken note. Letters were exchanged between landowners speculating about her, debating her origin, and considering the implications of such a rare phenomenon. The girl's existence had transcended the personal and entered the realm of legend, though she remained bound by the confines of the plantation and the master's gaze. Within the household, the master's obsession reached a level that bordered on mania. He attempted to regulate her exposure to light, instructed that she be present in certain rooms at precise times, and demanded reports from servants on every minute detail of her behavior. Each instruction, each observation reinforced the perception that she was an object of study rather than a human being. The girl felt this weight in every corner of her life, the constant scrutiny shaping her movements, dictating her gestures, and forcing her to navigate the fine line between compliance and resistance. Even subtle expressions of defiance or fatigue were noted and questioned, leaving her in a state of perpetual vigilance. The enslaved community, though adept at concealment and protection, could not erase the attention that surrounded her. Protective charms, whispered prayers, and careful supervision could mitigate risk, but they could not stop the inevitability of the world noticing her. The girl had to learn patience, discretion, and strategy. She learned which areas of the plantation offered relative safety, which visitors were to be avoided, and how to interpret subtle signs of observation. Her understanding of human behavior became almost tactical, a skill born of necessity, a survival mechanism honed over years of exposure to scrutiny and the threat of danger. As she matured, the girl also began to grasp the paradox of her condition. Her hair, the source of attention and fear, was also the source of influence. People responded to her not only out of curiosity or superstition, but because her presence carried weight. Her brightness, impossible as it was, had an effect on mood, behavior, and attention. Servants straightened their posture, children hushed their play, and even the master himself adjusted his demeanor in subtle ways whenever she was present. She began to perceive the power inherent in her anomaly, and to understand the responsibility it entailed. It was a burden she could neither relinquish nor fully control, a force that shaped interactions in ways both protective and threatening. Outside observers continued to speculate and theorize. Scholars and travelers debated her origin, suggesting everything from rare genetic mutations to supernatural phenomena. Some believed she was a sign of divine favor, others whispered of curses or hidden power. The diversity of theories reflected the impossibility of explaining her, and this uncertainty amplified her legend. Each new story added weight to her presence, contributing to a cycle in which myth and reality became inseparable. The girl existed simultaneously in the realm of human experience, and in the realm of speculation, a figure whose very existence challenged comprehension and demanded attention. Within the household and the enslaved community, the girl's life became a careful negotiation of visibility and concealment. Protective measures were constant, routes through the fields were altered, the timing of chores adjusted, interactions monitored. She had to balance the need for normalcy with the dangers inherent in exposure. Every act, every movement, every decision carried consequence. Yet in spite of this vigilance, the impossibility of her hair ensured that she could never be truly hidden. It glimmered in sun and firelight, in moonlight and shadow, signaling her presence, drawing attention and reminding everyone that she was both human and something more, something extraordinary, something that could not be explained by reason alone. And so she remained, a figure both feared and revered, a living contradiction that no science, superstition, or authority could fully explain. The world watched her from afar, whispered her name in hushed tones, debated her origin and power, yet none could touch the truth of her existence. Her hair, brilliant as snow and impossible as moonlight, became a symbol, a reminder that some mysteries refuse to be solved, that some truths are too powerful, too fragile, or too strange to be contained. Those who lived near her spoke of feeling her presence long after she had passed through, as if the light in her hair left an echo in the air itself. And though time marched forward, bringing change, loss, and the fading of memory, the legend and people who tried to claim her, to study her, or to explain her always left with unease, as though the girl herself had glimpsed inside them, exposing fear, guilt, and wonder alike. Her life, her brilliance, and her impossible hair became a story that no words could fully capture, a story of survival, of awe, of humanity, and of something beyond humanity, a story that would haunt the hearts and minds of all who encountered it, forever leaving behind the unsettling truth that some mysteries are meant never to be solved, and some lights once born cannot be extinguished.